Hi, welcome back to Lean Blog Interviews. I'm your host, Mark Graban. Our guest today is Hugh Alley. He's an author and a consultant. He divides his time between coaching senior operational leaders and continuous improvement. He also trains frontline leaders in core supervisory skills. He's taught more than 1,000 frontline leaders. He also helps design industrial facilities. He's an industrial engineer. He's run 3 manufacturing and distribution firms and a department in a government agency. And I'm going to interrupt my introduction and first off say welcome, Hugh. What kind of government agency was it? I'm just really curious.
The Workers' Compensation Board here in British Columbia.
All right. So in the category of everything is a process, everything
is a
involves
process.
People who can be coached and helped and improving processes.
And I was running a department that handled occupational diseases, and the lead time between when a claim was filed and when a decision was made was 100 days when I started.
Oh my!
And there were lots of the adjudicators that were really concerned about getting a right decision, and I kept pointing out that the challenge for the workers was that they needed a decision so they could know what to do.
Right. Yeah. Well, so then I know you have examples we're going to talk about, including, manufacturing cycle time reduction story. So we'll hear more about types of things that Hugh's been involved in and where he started. But coming back to the bio, he's written 2 books. The first is Becoming the Supervisor, Achieving Your Company's Mission and Building Your Team. And then the second is the TWI Memory Jogger, or the Training Within Industry, TWI Memory Jogger. Hugh speaks frequently about supervision, quality, lean manufacturing, and Toyota Kata. He's joining us from Vancouver, Canada. And I'm going to admit a mistake. I know, Hugh, you might say, oh, you didn't have to, but this is actually take 2 because we got some minutes into the first attempt at the interview and I realized I had misclicked and it was not recording. So Hugh, thank you for your graciousness and thanks again for being here again.
Well, I'm really happy to be with you, Mark. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about TWI. We're going to make some connections to sports and hockey and coaching. Hugh suggested a topic I'm really happy to dive into. But first, I like to ask people their lean origin stories. If you could tell us yours of, we'll go through all the W's and the why, where, when and where and why did you get introduced to lean and how and what did I skip? Well, what did you get taught?
Well, Mark, my first introduction to lean was pretty academic. I was I was working with a consulting firm at that point, and lean was getting to be the fancy new thing that consulting firms talked about. And so I read some stuff, but it didn't really land for me until I was working with a client in Alberta. And they were faced with a lead time that was about 6 months for their product. Long enough that although people loved the product, they weren't willing to wait 6 months for it.
Sure.
And so we worked with them. And what I saw in the time that we helped them is that they made a lot of little changes. And that kind of was one of the ahas of that experience. Is that it's not a one big thing. It's lots of little things that you make a change, see how it goes, and so on.
Yeah. Was the word Kaizen being used? Like, to me, that's Kaizen. Lots of little changes, not just a Kaizen.
No, we didn't use language. We're in Alberta. This is very much it would be equivalent to rural Iowa or something. This is not it was in a small town. They were not sophisticated, but they were great people. And over 8 months, we got their lead time down to 6 weeks. So they went from the worst in the industry to the best in the industry. And we ran into the problem that you so often do when you start applying these principles, is that all of a sudden the sales team is under pressure.
Because there was this, you work down the backlog and now you've got this capacity.
That's right.
To sell, right?
Because we had doubled their production rate, basically.
Yeah.
They went from 5 units a week to 9 or 10 and made a big difference.
Yeah. And you don't want to replace long lead times with overproduction.
No. So get out there. And the last part of our work there was actually with the sales team, sort of figuring out how they can sell their product faster.
Yeah.
So it was a really good introduction to it. And so then fast forward a few years, a friend invited me to join his company as their operations manager. And so I had that sort of in my experience at that point, and very much wanted to use it. And there what I discovered is that, well, two things. I discovered that my supervisors and my leads just didn't have the skills they needed. And I could, spidey sense told me that there was some toxicity going on. I couldn't put my finger on it right away, but it was very clear I needed to improve the skills of my supervisors and leads. Wasn't sure how to do it and tried a few things that didn't work. And then our mutual friend Tracy Defoe introduced me to the training within industry model. And we started with job relations. And that was like a light bulb for me. It was a revelation. And it's really driven much of my work since then. Yeah.
Tracy, by the way, was a guest, episode 467, for people who want to go back and find that episode, leanblog.org/467. And there's been some other episodes in the series focused really deeply on TWI, Patrick Graup, for example. So for people that are really new to TWI, we'll try to catch you up on terminology and phrases as we go. So you mentioned job relations, JR. Is that, in your experience, a typical starting point, or was that because of the culture as opposed to looking at job instruction, job methods? It was really about job relations there.
Yeah, I've done this for a lot of companies now, and I'm really convinced that you're going to either start with job instruction or job relations. And I've done it enough that I kind of, in my TWI memory jogger, there's a whole section on how to pick which one to start. And I've got a little sort of decision tree, if you will, that really hangs on what's the toxicity level in the plant. Because if your people don't trust your supervisors, doesn't matter what your instructions are going to be, how good your instructions are. They're not going to go with you. And so that's always when I'm having a conversation with a potential, an employer or a potential client. That's always my starting point, is let's figure out what that context is.
That probably happens in sports when a new coach gets hired. Maybe
no kidding.
Wade into kind of discussion around the sports world a little bit. New coach gets hired. Is it a clubhouse or locker room issue? Is it a tactical, strategic problem? Where do you need to overhaul the tactics? Do you need to overhaul some of the players, or do you have to just overhaul the way people are working together? Like Ted Lasso. I mean, I know we're going to talk about hockey. Have you watched Ted Lasso, I hope?
Absolutely love it.
Right. So Ted Lasso was really, I mean, not strictly job relations, but he was about the relations within that team, really focusing on that. He didn't know the tactics.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And yet he was hugely effective.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that, I think, in the sports teams too, is, and I would not want to be a sports coach, because of course all the pundits are looking for improvement in the next game, and that's not going to happen.
Well, why do you say that? Like game to game during a season, at some point, I mean, when would you look for that? I mean, is there continuous improvement that happens? There are some coaches, like I know, like the Buffalo Bills head coach in the NFL, actually uses the word Kaizen and talks about continuous improvement.
So I can see, if you've had a coach that has created a setting of fear, and that coach is removed, then I think you could see an immediate shift in the way the team's playing. And I saw that. I remember letting go supervisor, and he created a culture of fear in his area.
Yeah.
And when he left, first nobody could believe that I'd actually done it, made the move. But it was like that whole part of the plant just had this collective sigh. And we saw new leaders rise up out of that space, who had been just, suppressed, if you will. But there was all of a sudden a room. And so if you take out that bully effect, then I think you can see a fairly immediate shift. But if the issue is about how we work together, or about underlying skills, or about the lack of a common view of how we're going to play the game, if you're going to play the trap versus speed, it's a very different game, and you better have everybody on the team playing the same.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying is, when a new coach is hired, sometimes the pundits want that immediate turnaround. And it's funny, sometimes you do see that in different sports. A team struggling, coach gets fired pretty early in the season, and then they turn things around and end up in the playoffs, or even winning the championship. But then, there's times where, think of, like, in particular, I think, let's say college football, where you tend to have more variety of offenses. A team like Georgia Tech that was running kind of an old-fashioned wishbone option running offense, if eventually they bring in a coach who runs more of a Texas Tech throwing the ball all the time kind of offense, that's going to be a really rough transition, because they don't have the players. When you think about the impact of a system, you're hiring. Whoops, the NCAA wouldn't want to say hiring.
They're recruiting, yes.
It's getting close to hiring. You're recruiting players, the best players you can, to fit that system. And then when you change the system, like, nowadays a lot of kids are going to transfer out, transfer in. But you think about that, I don't know if there's a parallel to running, I don't know, an old-fashioned mass production system. And now deciding, okay, we're going to bring in a new head coach who's running lean. I went through that in General Motors, actually. That was a rough transition.
I bet.
You could say one system was quote unquote better, but that GM plant didn't have the supervisors or with mindsets in place to lead in a Toyota way.
Because if your mindset is, I'm going to run 1,000 of these red front seats, and then I'll do the left seats. That's a really hard mindset to get out of people, to make that shift, to see that it's okay to maybe let's instead of 1,000, can we do just 500?
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know,
yeah. But I think, there's that shift from bullying type coaches, or, I think of parallels to GM and some coaches that I've heard about in sports. There are some coaches that just constantly blame the players.
yes, you hear that
Directly or even kind of passive aggressively, of like, well, our schemes are fine, the players just need to execute.
Yeah.
And I think back to the first plant manager I worked under, GM. It was there was so much blame, and then we got a new head coach, plant manager, who had NUME training and
Oh,
experience.
that,
And he really did start talking about team, and like
yeah.
said pretty directly, the era of blaming the employees is over. We're going to lead differently. We're going to win together. I mean, he wasn't exactly Ted Lasso, but he was talking about, trying to establish, okay, different expectations. And you can't replace all the players on a team, but
No,
sometimes replacing the coach is huge. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just as you can't replace the people that are working for you. There's all, you can't just empty the plant or your organization and start over, because you got to keep producing whatever you are producing. However, whatever the challenges are, you still have to carry on. And so you don't get that chance, that choice. Now, over time, you can create context where people say, nah, that's not for me.
Yeah. They may transfer.
They may transfer.
They may leave as a free agent. So yeah, manufacturing companies don't trade employees with each other.
Yeah, they don't trade employees with each other, but it's interesting how a lot of employers think in terms of, well, I should just be able to hire what I need off the street. So and we hear this a lot in the media, and people complaining about how there are shortages of labor, shortages of skilled labor, as if for your plant with your specific products and machines, I should be able to just go out there and hire somebody.
Yeah.
And 50 years ago, that might have been possible, when all the machinery was mechanical, and so you were doing manual adjustments for the machines. There was relatively smaller product range. Think about it. I did a little bit of research in the 50s, 60s. If you wanted to buy a toaster, there are probably a dozen options in the market for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you go on to Amazon now, there are at least 600 different toasters on offer.
Wow.
So, the world is just a whole lot more complex. And then the third difference is 50, 60 years ago, there was still a set of mechanical skills that you could assume that most people had, because they were mostly coming out of the same cultural milieu. And today, and I don't know about sort of where you are in Austin, but I can tell you in Vancouver, we have half the population has come from outside Canada in the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And they're coming from all sorts of experiences. And you can't count on a lot of common experience. And so lots of people have never used a saw or a hammer or made an adjustment to a machine before. Yeah. And so now you're in a situation where you've got these people coming in raw, and they don't know what to do. And, back to the trading concept, you can't just go out and pull in from, another team's bench, the person with the exact skills you want. They're not there. And so it's one of the places where, back to TWI, job instruction's critical. because it allows you to take somebody who's smart, has capabilities in their own context, and now teach them new stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems even more critical today. I think it would be a mistake for someone to say like, oh, well, this program's old, it must be outdated. I mean, control charts were created in that same era a little before. They're also not outdated.
No.
The need might be even greater today.
Yeah, I would say so. Because the demands in terms of process conformance and product quality are higher today than they were then.
Yeah. So let's step back to where this conversation started with an email that you sent me, Hugh. Of, watching the NHL playoffs, watching your local Vancouver Canucks. Like, I always feel like Canuck is a word I feel like I shouldn't be able to say as an American.
Go for it. It's fine.
It's the team name.
Yeah.
I mean, like, the origin of that is similar to Yankees, New York Yankees, Canucks, Yankees.
Yeah. Johnny Canuck was a well-used and common appellation during the First World War, right? Yeah. That was the sole. You had G.I. Joe, and we had Johnny Canuck.
Okay.
So
I don't want to get canceled. I don't want to get canceled in 20 years if people decide it's no longer okay. So the Vancouver Canucks are playing. They made it into the Western Conference Finals, correct?
They did. Yeah.
I know. And then they lost to Edmonton. I was pulling for the Oilers in the Stanley Cup Finals. Canada. I want my Canadian friends to have a title again.
It would have been nice, but there were the example that had come to mind there is Edmonton had a very effective power play throughout the season. Like, it wasn't just the playoffs.
And for people who don't know hockey, like, if there's a penalty, player gets sent to the penalty box. They're playing a man down, so the team with the one-man advantage is quote unquote on the power play.
They are, and they have 2 minutes to try and take advantage of the situation.
And that should be a nice advantage. You expect
it should be
to score some percentage.
And yet, some teams, they'll only get maybe 1 goal out of 20 power plays.
Well, that was the Dallas Stars. I think they were 0 for 14.
Oh my!
Games they lost in. I think they lost their series in 5 games.
Yeah.
To Edmonton. So anyway, I mean, 0 for 15 is really bad. Like, scoring, what would be considered good? Like 40% would be. Yeah,
if you can get 40%, that's great. And Edmonton sometimes nudged over 50. Okay. So they were really very good at it. And they practiced setting up 2-on-1 and 3-on-2 situations in front of the opposing team's net. And what that meant is that you now had an uncovered guy,
right,
who could presumably have a clear shot. But they practiced doing that. And there are specific skills that you need to do about where you position yourself and how you respond when the defenders move into your space. But they practiced that so that they were very, very good at it. And
is that sort of a uniquely Vancouver power play strategy?
No, that was in the Edmonton power play strategy.
The Edmonton power play, sorry.
They were the ones that were so good at it.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it's uniquely, but what was unique is that they said, this is a skill we need to master, and we will practice it and build that skill set. So everyone on the team, and it didn't matter whether it was the first line, second line, third line, or even the fourth line, they were all doing the same thing. And that let, if Mark isn't available to go on the ice right now, I can send out Hugh and he'll still play with the same pattern.
Yeah.
And
routine.
And
Yeah,
the
because people watching
routine,
hockey, and look, I've never played hockey. I love watching the game. Sometimes you might think, oh, this seems like random skating around. Well, that you start seeing patterns of how
yeah,
players position themselves, and I think part of the key is not knowing where your teammate is, but where your teammate's going. That's the old
that's
Wayne
right.
Gretzky quote of
Yep,
knowing where the puck is going to be. He was exceedingly good at that, right?
exactly. Um, and I think you see the same thing in lots of other sports too, where uh, when they practice a particular move or set of moves, you know, then they get good at executing it.
Yeah.
And what we don't see, and this is the challenge of on business, is you don't get practice days,
Yeah.
which makes the how do you get better a
Mm-hmm.
little harder compared to a sports team. Um, but that's part of what the job of those frontline leaders is to
Mm-hmm.
help with the coaching of, if you did it this way, it will run better. Or let's do an experiment. Try it this way and measure it. Try it that way and measure it. And let's see which is better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because there will be one way that's better, and that's what we should be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting thought around practice days. I think of visits to Toyota plants where unlike sports teams that have seasons that start and end and have an off season, manufacturing or a hospital is running every day, continuous, never ending season. One thing Toyota does though when they hire new team members is they'll have, you might call it the equivalent of a training camp.
Yes.
They don't just hire that person and throw them into the game right away. They'll teach basic skills of all types. Toyota, I think, is pretty unique in that they have a gym and they have employees, if needed, go through some strength training and some
Mm.
fitness work before they're thrown into training, which might be the equivalent of, I don't know, if an exhibition game or a friendly, or at least
Yeah.
in a situation where they're certainly getting feedback and not just being thrown out onto the field.
Yeah. I have a client who makes a really interesting and complex electronic product. And it was taking them 3 months to bring new employees on to the point that they were consistently producing good products. And when they learned job instruction, uh, their world changed.
Mm-hmm.
They then had a focused learning process for 4 weeks. And at the end of that 4 weeks, they could take that individual and put them on the line, and they were producing at full speed.
Yeah.
So now they've shortened the training time
Well,
period.
there's another lead time story.
There's another lead time story. Yeah, they've shortened that lead time to get the player into play,
Mm.
uh, and they eliminated all the bad product
Mm.
that the previous approach had
Yeah.
generated.
Yeah. Having a process for that, or depending on what part of Canada, a process.
Yeah,
Either way.
either way,
Either way.
we'll accept both.
Okay. Um, but I think of, I mean, that's a really interesting idea of practice days. How could we create those? I mean, I think of a situation where, let's say in manufacturing, you've increased capacity and now sales is the constraint. You could shut down for periods and use that as practice days to develop skills, to learn new jobs, to do continuous improvement.
Yeah,
Right?
I think there are two real opportunities to create those practice
Mm-hmm.
situations. One is if you're able to make improvements that let you do a piece of work with fewer people. And I think of a client who he was setting up parts for a for powder coating. And he had a crew of 5 that were doing all this prep and then the painting. And he changed the way he was doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden he had a person free that he didn't need anymore. So all of a sudden you've got a person that you can move into a place and let someone go practice.
Yeah.
So you've got some extra capacity there. The other piece, and I think this is another interesting tie into sports, is supervisors or that frontline leader. Mm-hmm. Part of their job in at least some companies is to provide that relief, that backup, that outlet, that coverage that allows somebody to not be there for a little bit of time. Right. But I think we see this in most North American companies, is there are so few leaders. The ratio of leader to doer is so low. Well, there's the ratio of doer to leader is so high.
Leaders are spread so thin.
Yes, the leaders are spread so thin that they have no ability to do that. Yeah. And I certainly see that in the manufacturing world where I spend most of my time.
That happens in healthcare.
I was thinking that it probably does.
Sadly, yeah.
Yeah. And you start thinking about it. If you've got, the worst I ever saw was a supervisor who had 80 people reporting to him. He can barely say hello to everybody in the course of the day, let alone do anything constructive.
Right.
There's no opportunity there for improvement. And that turns out that company or that organization explicitly didn't care, which was really bizarre. But anyway, it made for a really uncomfortable work environment for people.
Yeah. Well, so how do you try to make the case that they should care? I mean, there's you can point to the success of other teams, if you will. I mean, I think, there's times in sports where a certain system or methodology wins and people want to, all right, I don't know if I fully understand this, but I want to copy their playbook. I want to try to copy their culture. I'm going to try to hire away assistant coaches and make them head coach because they can recreate that here. Doesn't always pan out. It's not that easy, whether it's sports or manufacturing, trying to copy the Toyota playbook or be inspired by it and create your own playbook. But
I think it really does take somebody with a bit of a vision for their part of their world. And with, if you're very close to the employees, you don't have perhaps as much influence as you like. But if by the time you're at a director level, you've got some opportunity to do skunk work kinds of things. And I kind of think that's what you got to do is sort of just nibble away at it at the edges where you can and show that you've made a difference. And the thing is, once you do that and then you free up that one person, now you've got something you can do something with. And
hopefully somebody doesn't swoop in and say, well, now you can lay them off or send them home.
Well, that's it. Yeah.
There's great risk if everyone's not on the same playbook.
That's right. Yeah.
And, I think and that's a challenge in healthcare. It's we'll call them short-term layoffs. Healthcare might like to call it flexing, but they'll say, well, we're halfway through the shift and patient census is down. There's less work to do. So we're going to send people home early, even though their fixed cost of commuting was the same.
Yeah.
And and you hear people say, leaders will say, well, we have to send people home. I'm like, I don't think there's a law on the books that says you must. It's a choice. You could have improvement time, practice time, skill development time.
And it's profoundly disrespectful of your
I
employees,
think
I think. You know, they've made a commitment to you to show up every day.
yeah. Well, and it's a short-term layoff, but please come back tomorrow.
Yeah.
And don't be disgruntled.
Yeah. Because we want to treat the patients nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's interesting when you look at sports teams, they have a lot of coaches. You know, you think about in football, you've got a defensive coach, and you've got a kicking coach, and you've got an offensive coach, and you've got a special teams coach, and you've got the quarterback coach, and sometimes you've got the throwing coach.
Yeah, there's a quarterback coach for, there's maybe at most three quarterbacks on the team. That's a 3-to-1 ratio.
Yeah. Now, admittedly, that's a pretty central role.
Right.
But, if the offensive line doesn't do their job, it doesn't matter how good the quarterback is.
Right. Right. So that's on the offensive coordinator or the head coach, or in a pro football context, it's on the general manager and the owner.
Yeah.
Like, there's just the different pieces of the puzzle of, are you good at finding the right players? Are you better at that than other teams? Are you willing to pay as much as other teams? There's different variables. Are you familiar with the book and then the movie Moneyball?
Oh, isn't it wonderful?
Around baseball, right?
Yeah.
The Oakland A's found a competitive advantage in identifying and valuing certain players differently than other teams did. The problem was, once other teams learn about that and it starts becoming more of the norm to really value on-base percentage over batting average, now that advantage goes away. And the Oakland A's have become, sadly, a team where the ownership is cheap and no one's showing up, and they're threatening or in the process of moving the team. They haven't found another way to be competitive. Some teams on the other end of the spectrum, like the New York Mets, I think almost always have the highest payroll in baseball, and they've been pretty terrible the last couple of years. So you can't guarantee that throwing money at it guarantees winning. Jerry Jones would love to win another Super Bowl in Dallas. Now, he's limited at how much money he can throw at players, though. So, there's these different constraints in different sports and different leagues.
But we have the same. You have the same thing in industry, right? You can choose what's your target pay range, your target paying compared to the market. And I've seen companies who deliberately say, we're going to pay. We want to be at the 25th percentile of pay, because that'll give us a competitive advantage in our labor cost. And I'm thinking, really, okay, if you're there and you've got somebody who's good, what are you offering them that'll make up for that point? But I also know of companies that do really, really well, saying, our target is not to be the best paying. Our target is, if we can be 75th percentile, we'll do just fine. We'll be able to coach our people into that stellar performance.
Yeah. And reduce turnover rates and costs that come with it, and all of the disruption that's so hard to quantify. But, and then I think there's also, the culture piece and engaging people. So this is, job relations, job methods, job instruction would contribute. Do people feel like they're set up for success in their job and they're happy? And I hear complaints in healthcare of like, oh, those nurses will leave and go to a competitor for 50 cents an hour difference. I'm like, well, if they were really super happy here, I'm not saying you should take advantage of that and underpay, but if they were really happy and engaged, you wouldn't be losing them over 50 cents an hour.
That's right. And it's interesting. I had the company that I moved to as operations manager, and I talked about the toxic culture, my spidey sense about toxicity. And there had been people already who had started leaving the company because they didn't like the way they were being treated. And we had some of those people come back to our company a couple of years later. And we knew they were taking $2 an hour less to come back to the company because they'd heard about the shift in the culture. And so it really can be a driver of people wanting to work there. And, I put it down to the skills in job relations that my leadership team had learned from team leads, supervisors, me, my boss, and all of a sudden that respect for people, the recognition, people doing the 4 foundations of giving credit when it's due and letting people know how they're doing and not making changes without letting people know. Those things were happening and people liked that, surprisingly. And then we were really using the how to handle a problem part of job relations. And that gave people this sense that even if they didn't like the outcome, they knew they were being treated fairly.
When you think about that scenario of coming back happily, I guess, for $2 an hour less, they might feel like ideally I'd be happy in this job and not take a pay cut. But we look at sports where a young player doesn't want to be drafted by a losing team, or an older player who knows their time is short. They'll take less money. They've already made a ton, oftentimes, but they will sign a lower contract to have a chance to go win a ring that they haven't gotten yet, to win a championship. That kind of payoff isn't necessarily there exactly the same, but I think it does feel good to be on a winning team.
Sure it does.
Even if there's not a big gaudy ring that you get to put on your finger. Let's say you go to a plant that wins a Shingo Prize. They don't give every employee a diamond ring the way a sports team would, but it still feels good.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
There's pride that you can have. That's fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
But one thing I think is great about TWI is having a methodology for how to coach the players, if you will, a methodology to become a better coach. And one thing I wanted to talk about, I think there's parallels between, say, nursing and other healthcare professions, manufacturing or engineering, and sports. Like, how do you help increase the chances that a great player can also be a great coach? Because we know there are some that have excelled in coaching and some that have been pretty terrible at coaching. I think the one example that gets used, I think, isn't completely unfair. Ted Williams in baseball, one of the greatest hitters of all time. I think he knew he had a lot of conscious competence, but there might have been some unconscious competence. And from what I remember or what I've heard, it's history for me when he was, that he just wasn't an effective hitting instructor. How do you translate what he knew? Could you really create a job breakdown, a job instruction for how to hit 400 in a season and to be an all-time great? If it was that easy to teach, more players would achieve the levels that a Ted Williams did.
Yeah. So in 1939, one of the sort of triggers to the thinking about, we've got a shortage of job skills, was lens grinders. And in 1939, if you wanted to create a new lens, train a new lens grinder, the wisdom was that was a job you could learn in 5 years.
To get good, or to even be basically competent?
Basically competent, to be released on your own.
Wow.
And they looked at that and said, the war is going to be over and we won't be on the winning side if that's how long it takes.
Yeah.
And so that was really the starting point. And they got some smart people together who'd been thinking about training for a while and said, okay, how can we break this down? Because it had been presumed that it was an art. And you just have to get the feel for it. Have you ever heard that? Right. You just have to get the feel for starting the IV. But in fact, it's a trainable, learnable thing.
Yeah.
So you just have to get the feel for it. Well, no, actually, you can, if you are careful and observe carefully, you can figure out what those art elements are, by and large. Not always, but in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And 6 months later, having looked at that, they could then train somebody in 5 months. And 2 years later, companies had got it down to a week, 5 days.
Yeah.
So you take somebody green off the street and have them producing lenses at production rates in 5 days. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And so I'll bet there is stuff that can be learned using the job instruction breakdown process that could get more batters hitting. Well, maybe not 400, but maybe closer to it.
Yeah.
Maybe
250 is a good number anymore.
Yeah.
Changed, but yeah, 300 would be
outstanding. Yeah. Right. So I run into this a lot in industry. People say, "Oh, it takes too long." There's an art, or a manager will say, "We can't teach that. That's really, they just need some experience." And I'm thinking, yeah, but they're learning something in that experience.
Well, but and you might develop bad habits. Doing the same thing over and over doesn't guarantee that you get good at it. But like, you look at baseball, though. So right now, there's a lot of talk about how there's so many strikeouts, batting averages are really low, runs per game are down a little bit. You draw control charts, you realize the media is overreacting to 2 data points. But back to pitching, you say, well, how is it that everybody coming out of the bullpen is throwing 98 miles an hour now, it seems? Because they have learned like the biomechanics, and they are teaching pitchers. You've got to have a requisite size and ability. But it used to be like, oh, well, it was like fixed mindset of like, well, that kid inherently throws hard. Now they can teach almost everybody through specific methods of arm angle, and they can just really really analyze and teach those mechanics. I think they are breaking it down, even if they're probably not strictly using TWI.
No, probably not. But you think about any athlete, like a sprinter, right? What do you do in those first 3 steps off the blocks? Yeah. What's the motion you need to take? A friend of mine was a rowing coach. And so you say, well, how much can you improve in a rowing thing? But this guy said, look, as long as you give me somebody who's got decent stamina, let me have them for 2 million strokes and I can give you an Olympic rower. Because it takes that long to perfect the stroke. Wow. Because it's that subtle. Now, I'll bet you, using the TWI model, you could get that down to maybe 1 million strokes or maybe even 500,000. But it's getting the mechanics exactly right on every stroke. And, I paddled competitively for a while as an adult. And for me to string 3 strokes together in a row and have them really good strokes was tough. So I get, we're not talking about it's not simple. It's not an easy thing, but it can be done. And I think a lot of people underestimate what's possible in terms of breaking a job down so that you can teach it to people quicker, so they can learn faster.
Yeah. And then, there's the opportunity, and maybe the difference in pro sports is the people, that are driven to keep improving. They have a lot of talent to begin with, and they've been working hard. So sometimes you might look at results and question the opportunity to improve. So I watch a lot of Cincinnati Reds baseball these days. I'm in Cincinnati a lot. Ellie della Cruz is in his 2nd season, is phenomenally exciting to watch. He's 6'6". hits the ball a mile. He's also one of the fastest, if not the fastest player in the league. He's leading the major leagues in stolen bases by a wide margin at the time of recording this late June. So you might say, well, what does he have to work on? He's leading the league in steals. He's successful at a high percentage. Well, I saw him talking, I think it was in one game, where he's not like that sprinter with the super refined, effective takeoff. When he takes off from first to second, he kind of throws his arms up in this weird, like kind of seems like wasted motion sort of way. And they sort of joke that he's waving bye-bye. But no, he's just kind of flails his arms, and he's fast enough to make up for it.
Mm-hmm.
But, what they were saying is that, working with him to tighten up the takeoff, if you will,
Yes,
is only going to help him be even better. Or, in a couple of years, if he starts to slow that max running speed a little bit, I mean, like, he still has room for improvement. And I'm sure they do video analysis, and they're working with him on how do you develop that new habit of whatever he should be doing with his arms as he takes off for second. And some organizations are like, yeah, we're pretty good. Back outside of sports, like, we're ahead of everybody. Well, then what happens when others catch up to you? Are you driven to continuously improve or not?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that points to the thing that I have seen is people saying, oh, I want to benchmark against others in my industry. And I keep thinking, it really doesn't matter what the others are doing.
Yeah.
It's, are you better than you were yesterday?
Yeah. Well, when people say they want to benchmark, sometimes I think, well, really?
Yeah.
I mean, do you? Because I've seen and heard of people going on benchmarking trips, and then all they do is list all the reasons why we can't do what that other organization does. I'm like, why'd you go? Like, I've got historical documents from the auto industry that are in a library about, Ford and the UAW going to Japan in the early 80s, and then just coming home and poo-pooing, like, what they're doing isn't that special.
Yeah.
We couldn't do those things, or we don't need to do those things. Yeah. They were slower to react than might have been ideal.
Yeah. Yeah, that mindset of that frontline leader, part of their responsibility is to make sure that the standard of execution is just nudging up all the time. And that's what the job methods was about, right?
Yeah.
It was about the supervisor in their little portion of the plant. How can you make a little changes that just make that part of the plant operate that much better? Mm-hmm. And it was not about, investing hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was, okay, what happens if you move that bench 20 feet that way? Or what happens if you do things in a different order? You do X before. Or what I saw in a medical lab one time, where we discovered that the 5 people in the lab all had different understandings of what they should do first when they finished a task. And so they were all working at cross purposes. And when they all had the same set of priorities, they dropped the waiting time of their patients in half. It was remarkable.
Yeah. Well, one other thing I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot, you're not a Wayne Gretzky biographer, but asking a Canadian and a hockey fan about Wayne Gretzky seems like fair game. We'll say he's the greatest hockey player of all time, the winningest, also leading scorer.
Yeah.
That's not a controversial statement, right?
No.
But what I think is interesting, or what's I think a little controversial, is, he was a terrible head coach, or he was a good head coach in bad situations. You coached the Phoenix Coyotes, never won a Stanley Cup as a coach, and he seems to be one of those stories of like, great players necessarily aren't going to be a great coach. He's doing broadcasting now. There's a CBC article that doesn't load, even though it comes up in Google, where the headline was, forget the numbers, Gretzky was a good coach. And it says, the excerpt that shows, indeed, he was a smarter and better coach in the last game he worked than he was the first. That doesn't sound like a failure. Maybe he just picked the wrong job. What do you say?
Well, I'm not familiar enough with Gretzky's performance as a coach.
The Phoenix Coyotes, who cares?
I wasn't watching the Coyotes closely.
A lot of people weren't, even in Phoenix.
Yeah. But look, most people who have supervisory roles get their job a little bit like the main character in my book, Becoming the Supervisor, which is somehow, with some quirk of fate, it's okay, you be the supervisor. I have one friend who tells me that literally he was the last person to step backwards. The coordinator, the supervisor in the area had left, and the manager said, okay, who wants to be a supervisor? And everyone except him stepped backwards. And he got the job.
Kind of like stepping up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
and he was actually a really good welder, but he never had any experience before as a leader. 8 months later, with some coaching and some guidance and instruction, he turned into a really good leader, and he moved from being somebody that his crew despised to somebody who his crew listened to and worked with. And it was remarkable to see. So it's a set of learnable skills. And I think if there's a takeaway from our conversation, Mark, I think it needs to be that these are learnable skills. TWI is not the only way to learn these skills, but gosh, it's a good one. And it's one that I haven't seen a better systematic way to do it. And so, nobody's born a supervisor.
Older child, first child syndrome becomes a supervisor when
but that doesn't mean they're good at it.
They could be a bully too.
They could be a bully, right? But it's a learnable skill, and I think that's the piece that we want to. That I want people to come away knowing is that this is stuff that you can master. Will you be the best in the world? Maybe not. But will you be better? Will you make the working lives of the people you work with better? Yes. Yes, absolutely. And people will want to come back and work with you tomorrow. And that matters.
It does. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. So again, we've been joined by Hugh Alley. I'm glad we could weave the conversation, I think, in and out of sports and different types of workplaces that listeners maybe relate to. Again, Hugh's books are Becoming the Supervisor, Achieving Your Company's Mission, and Building Your Team. And the second book is the TWI Memory Jogger. I'll put links in the show notes about how you could connect with Hugh and learn about the books and buy them and read them and put them to use. So, Hugh, this has been fun. Thank you for doing the episode. And I do have to say, thank goodness I discovered it was 5 minutes in when I'm like, oh, no, it's not recording. Had we done this 59-minute conversation, I would have been mortified because I did that once, different technologies, and it was I've been doing this so long now. It was probably 13, 14 years ago. I don't even remember who it was, but I fessed up to it. I didn't pretend like it was a technical glitch. I didn't record that, and someday I'm going to remember who it was, or but they were so kind. They're like, well, okay, we'll do it again, but better.
Yep.
So, thank you. So I only asked you to repeat the first couple of minutes. So Hugh, thank you again for being a good sport and for being a guest here today.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.